Well, I'm delighted, Michael Ots, to have the opportunity to interact with you today about the work of the public evangelist, and especially about your work in Europe, and particularly European universities. Why don't you tell us, to start off, something of the nature of the ministry in which you've been engaged for the last 15, 20 years?
Yeah, so most of my work is involved with university students. That began really in the UK 15 years ago, being invited to speak at a mission week, which then grew into further invitations that spread across the country, and then developed about 10, 11 years ago with the inception of the FOIA network, this network of evangelists across Europe, and then grew right across Europe and then to other parts of Eurasia as well, as far as Siberia. And my main role really is to speak at week-long mission events in universities, often at the invitation of the local Christian students, in partnership with the local churches. But as well as that, often going before the mission begins to help train the students, equip them in personal evangelism, and prepare them to make the most of the mission events.
Well, why public proclamation? Because many people say that we're living in cultures that are increasingly word resistant and opposed to anybody attempting to make any authoritative statement on anything. That seems to be part of our culture these days. Many people, therefore, ask, what's the point of public proclamation or preaching? How do you defend what you're doing, and how do you defend the role of preaching, especially in the communication of the gospel in the 21st century?
Yeah. I guess the first thing I'd say is it's biblical, so that's why we do it. And I think sometimes we can be too geared by immediate fruit and immediate success. And if something doesn't bear immediate success, we just ditch it. And I think there's a problem with that sometimes, because there are things that we should be doing, even if in the short term we don't see immediate fruit from that. And that's obviously how we see the gospel grew in the first century, which, by the way, was, of course, as diverse a society as we live in today, with all the issues of morality and pluralism that we face in Europe today. And so the proclamation of the gospel was obviously integral to the growth of the church in the first century. And when you look at the growth of the church through history, it's also been a central part of that, alongside small group evangelism and personal evangelism as well. So I think we do it because it's biblical. I think sometimes people's reaction against preaching and proclamation is because they've seen bad examples of preaching and proclamation. And so certainly working sometimes with students who are nervous about doing a mission week or doing something like that, they are nervous because they've seen models of preaching which aren't necessarily culturally engaged, accessible, and so they are reacting against not preaching per se, but they're reacting against a bad model or an outdated style of preaching, which doesn't always work. But I think actually where you have preaching that is biblically faithful, but also rooted in the culture, applied, connected, it can really have an impact. And wonderfully, we have seen it having an impact across Europe. So not just in missions in the UK, but in the whole of Europe, west, north, south, east, people coming to faith. It's worth saying it's not revival. We're seeing 1s, 2s, 10s, 20s at most. But we are seeing the gospel having an impact. And as the gospel is being proclaimed, people responding to it. So I think helping people to see good models of gospel proclamation and helping people to see what that could look like as well. Often when people think preaching, they think maybe of a church building, a simple exposition of a passage. And what we're trying to do is say proclamation is biblical and it's central, but we can do that in any venue whatsoever. So normally in the context of universities, it can be lecture rooms, it can be wine bars, it can be cafes. Also in the context of a community that's warm and welcoming. So people aren't coming into a cold building normally to sit in rows and listen to a lecture. They're coming into an environment where they're often eating food, they're listening to music, they're welcomed. There's a sense of community into which the proclamation is given. And then also using creative aspects in the proclamation as well. So often we'll go for a magazine format of presentation. So there may be a half an hour talk, but that's interspersed with testimony, music, dramatic sketches and so on. So people aren't listening for extended periods of time, and people are being communicated with not just through their ears, but through their eyes as well.
So really you're arguing for proclamation in community, which is also creative. So I guess there's a distinction really between the principle of proclaiming the gospel in a public context, and the methodology. The principle is abiding, but the methodology may vary according to the cultural context. In some universities, I guess you're not able to get a lecture theatre or do things on campus, so you've got to do it off campus in cafes
And actually,
and so on.
what's interesting is, particularly in an evening event, a lecture theatre is rarely the best kind of venue for people to really engage, because people have spent the day in a lecture theatre. They don't want to go back necessarily in the evening. So creating a warmer environment, and particularly eating a meal and speaking afterwards, we find creates an environment that means that people are more receptive. It also means that the means fits the message, because if you think one of the predominant metaphors of the kingdom of God and of the gospel is this invitation to a feast, to a meal. What we're doing by inviting people to eat together is modeling something of the gospel that we then communicate from the front as well. So we're trying to communicate by the very form of the event that we're organising something of the gospel, as well as in the talk from the front.
Now, you mentioned a focus on preaching or proclamation, but you also mentioned that a lot of your work is done in universities, university campuses across Europe. Why are you focusing on the university? Why is it so central to your ministry, to the focus of your ministry?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in some ways, it wasn't something that I intentionally planned. I was involved in all sorts of ministries when I first started out as an evangelist about 16 years ago. And I guess there were two things that happened. One was the invitations to universities grew exponentially faster than any of the other invitations that I was getting to do youth, children's ministry or things like that. But secondly, I guess I realized that there was a strategic value to university ministry that I felt was important to make the most of. I think the opportunities for evangelism whilst you're a student are often the best opportunities you're going to get in your life. A friend of mine put it this way. They said, in life, you have people that you live with, you have people that you work with, and you have people you socialize with. And in most of life, there are three different groups of people. But when you're a student, they're all the same people. And so the depth of relationships you can develop are far quicker and far more intense than you would get later on in life when you're in work and maybe bringing up a family. So into those depth of relationships that are formed very quickly in that 3, 4, 5 year period, the opportunities to invest for the gospel are great. And then, of course, people are away from home, they're forming their worldview, they're thinking about the big questions of life. They've got time to do that before the urgency of family and work take over. And if they come to Christ as a student, they've got the rest of their life then to be shaped by that in whatever field of work and ministry they go on to afterwards. So I often look back and think my own father was converted as a student at university in Cardiff. And of course, the fruit of that is that he went on to form a Christian family. And of course, I'm now involved in student ministry 40 years later. So the long-term impact of student ministry can be really strategic.
I guess that's a key point, because quite a number of pastors I've talked to have been a bit fearful of university ministry unless they begin to understand that for 3 or 4 years of investment in these young lives, potentially you get 40 years of payback as people become involved as deacons, Sunday school teachers, elders, and in other roles in local churches. So student ministry across Europe and globally has contributed enormously to the strengthening of the church.
And it's amazing to see how many church leaders and strategic leaders of Christian ministries in the world have been involved in ministry as a student through their local student group. And that's been so formative. You were saying earlier as well about how, particularly in the Reformation, the university was key as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. I mean, Luther himself said in 1523, if you want to change the world, start with the university. And when the Reformation began under his leadership from 1517 onwards, there were actually very few university centres in what is present-day Germany, perhaps not much more than about 8. But when he finished, when he died, there were about 50 university centres. He himself, of course, became a Christian as a young university professor in Wittenberg. Calvin was converted as a young student in Orléans in France also. And historically, this is a good argument for stating the case that the gospel in the time of the Reformation spread across Europe through the universities, particularly into the UK, where it penetrated Oxford and Cambridge, where a lot of people were converted, some of whom became evangelical bishops. later on. So some historians used to argue that it was the princes, the German princes, who were critical, certainly for the German Reformation.
Yeah.
But if you look at the Reformation in Europe as a whole, there's no doubt it spread through these burgeoning universities. And Luther himself had a very high view of education and argued that the education of children, boys and girls, in schools and universities was actually pretty pivotal to the advance of the gospel. He saw no contradiction between being well educated and being a follower and disciple of Jesus Christ. Well, student work has grown immensely in the 20th century with groups all across Europe. And you mentioned you do these mission or events weeks. Could you give us some insight into typically both what happens in the week and how you position that events week so it's part of an ongoing process through the year in the university?
Yeah, absolutely. So we call them a mission week. It can be anything from 3, 4, 5 days long. Probably minimum 3 days, because one of the purposes of having a week of events rather than just a one-off event is that you have a cumulative impact of being able to build on what's been said before, building the interest and the publicity and all of that goes with it. So it would normally be a series of events where the gospel will be communicated, proclaimed publicly. Sometimes that can be in different settings, a lunch talk where people are coming in between their lectures. In that context, normally it would be a shorter talk with a kind of punchy opportunity for us asking questions. In most missions, a kind of more relaxed, informal evening events, often including food and music, where people can come, engage, converse. Again, the gospel's presented in creative means sometimes, along with the talk, with music, drama, and so on. And then again, normally an opportunity for asking questions. And then, because of course in the evenings people are not rushing off for lectures, the opportunity for people to have one-to-one conversations with the friends that they've brought. And the means by which people come to that is twofold, really. Firstly, people come because their Christian friends invite them, and so a big part of preparing the group is to help them to be confident in the concept of the mission, the evangelist who's going to speak, and the gospel itself, so that they want to invite their friends. But also we try to make sure that publicity is significant so that actually you make a splash across the whole university. And that's where doing a series of events has the capacity to potentially have a greater impact than just a one-off event. So during the daytime, there'd normally be forms of publicity, people handing out flyers, stalls, question boards, and so on around the university, generating interest, creating questions, and inviting people obviously to come along to the events. And through those two kind of means, we get people coming along. And then the idea is that because we have events every day, if people come the first day, they not only can enjoy hearing the gospel once, they can come back and hear the gospel a number of times. Normally what happens is that if they enjoy it, they bring their friends. So we find that the attendance at the events grows significantly from the first day to the last day, sometimes doubling, trebling, or even quadrupling. And you end up with non-Christians coming along who invite their friends because they've not yet heard that evangelism is meant to be scary, so they do it without even knowing they're doing it. But I think the impact is that people, because they can hear the gospel many times, are more likely to come to faith through a week like that than if they just heard the gospel once. A survey was done in the States a few years ago, suggesting that it took on average 32 contacts with the gospel for someone to go from no understanding of the Christian faith to conversion on average. Obviously, it could happen shorter or longer in some cases. And our normal reaction to that is to say, well, it's just going to take a long time for anyone to become a Christian. But actually, the mentality of a week of events or a mission is to say, how can we create as many opportunities for people to hear the gospel in a short space of time? And it's not uncommon for people to come and hear the gospel presented 5, 10, even 15 times during a week, to potentially have another 5 or 10 serious conversations with Christians or the speaker as the week goes on. And alongside that, to start reading one of the gospels that would be giving away, maybe some of the Christian literature that would be taken away as well. And if you think all of that combined together could potentially create 20 or more significant inputs during that week, which is why it's not uncommon in a week-long series of events for people to commit to Christ, not normally at the beginning of the week, but often at the end, because they've had so many opportunities to hear not just the core of the gospel, but something of the framework of Christian worldview, to ask their questions, to get a sense of the reasonableness of the Christian faith. And so the impact of a week of events is often far greater than 5 individual events spread out over the year. Although what we would say is that we want to position that as the culmination, really, of a year-long outreach events or outreach efforts. So in many universities, it would happen in the second semester or the second term, where the Christian students have already had opportunities to build friendships with non-Christian friends and colleagues. You've probably had a number of one-off events in the build-up to this. But it's not so late in the term that you haven't got time to do follow-up, because the key thing is after the week is finished, obviously you want to follow up those who are still skeptical and seekers, but also help integrate new believers into the life of the local church and make sure they're discipled before the summer holidays come round.
Well, if you could give us an illustration of the impact of, on average, I understand you do about 10 university mission weeks a year across Europe. The impact of that you've seen of one of these missions in one of the countries. I'll share one story because you're probably too embarrassed to mention it yourself. But we did a citywide mission week in the university and the city of Manchester last year, covering 4 universities in 1 week. And it was called Story. And each evening we had an interview with someone for about 20-25 minutes, followed by a talk on that theme. And on the Tuesday evening, I interviewed a top cancer expert from Oxford who was professor of surgery when he was in his 20s. He left to become a vicar or a leader of a church. And he answered questions on a Christian response to the problem of suffering from the perspective of a surgeon or a medic. 2 nights later on, you were speaking actually on the theme of finding freedom in Christ. And after the meeting was over, I was going around the hall talking with folks, and I just happened to come across one guy who was a nuclear physicist doing a doctorate. And I said to him, what do you think about this evening? He said, well, I committed my life to Christ. And I said, oh, how did that happen? He said, well, I've been coming to these events for 3 years. This is my 3rd successive year. And he said, on Tuesday night, I heard this surgeon being interviewed. He was much more brilliant than I am, and he gave the best answer I've ever heard to the problem of suffering in the world, and also to how science and faith come together. So he said, after this evening's talk on freedom, I have no objections or questions left. I give in. And what was interesting was when I asked the Christians, I told the Christians about him, they said, he's been like the Apostle Paul the last 3 years. He's been like a scourge through the Christian student group, hostile to us and so on. So at first they wouldn't believe that he'd come to faith that day, but he really had, and is integrated into the life of a church now. So that highlights really the importance of building momentum. In his case, he'd been coming for 3 years to these events, and also providing reasoned responses to the kind of questions he had, which were mainly revolving around a Christian response to suffering and the interaction of science and faith. And then the whole question of, do you lose your freedom? Will God spoil my life? Rather than the biblical indication that it's spoiled already before turning to Christ. So that was a wonderful experience for me in seeing how part of that process had been going on for a while. And before that, there'd been a carol service at Christmas and various other events. So I guess it's symptomatic of our cultural context, where students are starting further back. And as you hinted at, they're taking longer to be able to make intelligent responses. But why it's important to provide that systematic response to people's objections. And of course, it gives confidence to believers as well, as they begin to see the defensibility of the Christian message. But I wondered if you could give us an illustration from one of the many mission weeks you've been on of how you've seen the impact, not just in the week, but if you've been able to go back 6 months or a year or even 2 years later, and you've seen the impact there and like ripples going out, perhaps even in other parts of the country.
Yeah. Well, one of the countries that's been really encouraging to work with over the last few years has been Belarus, and to see how ministry's grown there in a context which I guess a few years ago we'd have thought would have been unlikely for the gospel to grow, given some of the restrictions that they face in terms of activities there. And to see how the students there have taken this idea of mission and really driven it forward in spite of opposition has been really significant. I did now over the last few years 4 different missions in different cities across the country. I did 2 in the same city on consecutive years, and it was really encouraging. The first year I went, we had a fairly good mission. A couple of people came to faith. I'll never forget the last night, though, because I was speaking on the resurrection, and there was a guy who was sitting right at the front of the meeting, and he literally sneered through the entire talk and said, you could just see the contempt on his face for everything that I was saying. And then at the end, he came up. He was a very antagonistic atheist, and I was exhausted at the end of the week, and frankly, just a bit discouraged that this, was my last conversation with anyone at the end of the week. I was then surprised to hear that despite his antagonism towards what he had heard, he then came to the follow-up Bible studies for the next number of weeks with his girlfriend, in fact. Didn't become a Christian then, and then dropped off the kind of radar afterwards, having not committed his life to Christ. But then appeared again the following year when I went back to do the mission week. And I sat with him after the final talk, which had also been on the resurrection at the last night. And I turned around and I said, "How have you found this week?" And he referred back to the illustration I'd just given of Revelation 3:20, Jesus standing at the door and knocking. He says, "It's been great. I've just opened the door." I said, "Sorry." He says, "Well, I've just opened the door. I want Jesus to come in." And it was a remarkable instance of a year later, a guy who'd been so antagonistic, having met Christians, been welcomed into community, having had the opportunity to ask questions, to see the Christian faith credibly explained. And then after the second mission week, coming to response of faith in Christ was wonderful. And actually that group has grown. So just recently I was in Belarus, not in that particular city, but hearing news from that city. And this year, their mission was even bigger than they had before, bigger numbers coming along. They had over 50 come to their follow-up course. They'd expected about 20, and so they had to go and recruit new leaders, because these were 50 non-believers wanting to come and study the gospel as a result of that week, a number that had come to faith. And so the work there is really blossoming. One of the encouragements there as well is that they can reach out to international students who come from countries that wouldn't get into other parts of Europe because of the political situation. So we have quite a number of students who come to missions in that country who come from Central Asian republics, countries that it would be almost impossible for us to visit, let alone go and do mission work in. And just a month ago, speaking at a mission in a different city in Belarus, we had a student come along from a nominal Muslim background in this particular country. His question on the first night was, why should I believe your Jewish myths when I have the Quran?
Wow.
So a fairly blunt question, to which I was able to give a fairly direct answer. And he appreciated the honesty and the directness. And we had some conversations afterwards talking about the historicity of the Quran versus the historicity of the Bible. He came along every night to all the events of that week, to each of the 4 evenings. By the third evening, you could see that he was starting to soften to what was being said. And by the last evening, he indicated that he had responded to trust in Christ. And on the last day, he met me at the railway station as I was about to leave the city to get the train back to Minsk to fly home, just to say goodbye. And his words were, he said, "Thank you for telling me the truth about Islam. No one has told me the truth about it before. And thank you for sharing what you shared about Jesus." And then his parting question was, how can I know for sure Jesus has come into my life, and where do I go from here? So it was just wonderful to see people coming to faith, and talking to some of the student workers there. There have been others like him who've now gone back to be effectively missionaries into a very closed country and to continue the work there.
So the message goes around the world, as Francis Schaeffer used to say. You're creating ripples that go on forever. Michael, you've also been part of, you mentioned at the beginning, a network called FOIA, the Fellowship of Evangelists in the Universities of Europe, and you had a leadership role in that, which has also involved trying to unearth and develop a network of evangelists around Europe. Can you tell us something about this loose network, how it's developed over the last 10 years, and what its vision is?
Yeah, sure. Well, you should be doing it yourself because you started it. But it really began 10 years ago with this desire to encourage the public communication of the gospel in universities across Europe. Because we saw that although there were pockets of activity, places like the UK, Ireland, Germany, where that was happening and the idea of a mission week was regularly taking place, there were other places where that wasn't particularly happening. And often because Christians were so much more in the minority, evangelical Christians in those countries, there was a sense in which we couldn't do anything publicly because we're just too small to have an impact. And so the network really brought people together over the course of a weekend in the autumn each year. People who were either already involved in that or who had a heart or an interest in getting involved in that. It was organised by IFES, but actually not everyone who comes to it is from IFES ministries. Anyone who has a heart for student ministry and for the proclamation of the gospel is involved in it. And it's been wonderful really to see how that's grown. And I think a few things that have been key. One, because it's been deliberately kept small, no more than about 150 people, networks and friendships have developed that have been very fruitful for the gospel. And I think sometimes when conferences grow exponentially, the opportunity for real networking and relationships can sometimes be lost. And so there have been really strong friendships that have been developed, which have developed into gospel opportunities. So when I first went, I remember asking you where you think I should go, and you said, well, I'm not going to tell you where to go, just get to know people. And through those friendships, invitations came, I think initially to Serbia and then to Norway, and then off the back of that to other countries too. So it's been a very exciting place to bring people together who have a very similar heart for a very specific aim of seeing the gospel proclaimed publicly. And then alongside that, the opportunity has been there for people to come and see a public mission week. Initially, that was in the UK most of all, but now actually, because they're happening all over Europe, people are going from everywhere to see this concept. And what that does is it helps students or maybe staff who are somewhat skeptical about the feasibility of a mission week to actually see firsthand what happens, and then to think about how they could take that model and the principles that they've seen and then apply it into their own context. And that's been really dynamic. So just recently, we had some students come from the Netherlands to the mission week that we were doing in the north of England in Newcastle. And by the end of that week, they were so much more enthusiastic about the concept of a mission and so much more better prepared to then do something similar. And just 2 weeks ago, we had their first mission week in the city of Maastricht, which went really, really well. But part of the enthusiasm for that came from seeing a concept somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So that idea of bringing people together, providing them training and opportunity for fellowship and encouragement, and then giving people opportunity to see stuff firsthand and then to get their hands dirty, as it were, and give it a go. And that's really grown and developed over the years. I mean, you would have a picture of just give us some of the numbers now of missions that are going on.
Well, from small beginnings, even this year, we're in the month of May now, in the first 4 months of the year. There are about 60 core members of this team of evangelists spread across 34 countries. And they've done these mission weeks already in 170 universities across Europe. And certainly they will do them in 200 university cities across the continent by the end of the year. And the goal would be to unearth and develop at least one university evangelist in every country across Europe. Our time is running out, but I do want to ask you two questions. They can cut out one of them if they want to at the end. Yeah. The first is, do you see much hope in the universities across Europe? Is there a changing atmosphere? Of course, we're faced with sometimes hostile secularism. Is that the case now? Are you finding students are very resistant to the gospel? Are you finding changes, any greater degree of openness? What's your sense of where we're at in terms of response to the gospel across the continent of Europe these days in the universities?
That's a good question. It's interesting. I was speaking somewhere recently, and someone said, "Why are the universities so hardened to the gospel?" And I said, "Well, actually, I don't think they are. I think there has been a significant shift, really, in the last 10 to 15 years, in the cultural climate of Europe, and then that's obviously often first reflected in the universities. We see that kind of come up through the rest of society." I think if you think back 15 years ago, 9/11 had just taken place. People like Richard Dawkins and the New Atheist were getting a lot of the limelight in the media. And so many students had imbibed, even if they hadn't read, the ideas of people like Richard Dawkins. And there was a very strong, hostile, antagonistic atheism that you would come into contact with. And we used that as an opportunity. So many of the talks that we would have looked at back then were addressing many of the objections of the New Atheists. You know, the objection that religion was dangerous, that science had debunked faith, that there was no evidence for God, and that kind of stuff. But the environment to which we were speaking was often quite a hostile one, and particularly when you got to the Q&A, you braced yourself for the kind of questioning that you would get at the end, which would often be quite visceral. Very little of that still remains, I would suggest now. It's interesting, even the New Atheists, some of them now admit that New Atheism as a movement has been and gone, even though they're still atheists. They recognise that its limelight has faded. And I think and actually recent surveys reflect this, that there's a decline in atheism and a rise in a more open agnosticism, particularly amongst students. Now, it's interesting because people are surprised by that, because people pay a lot of attention to what the establishment says and what the media says, and the media can still be quite hostile towards the Christian faith, and the establishments in certain European countries can be too. But on the ground in the university, I think the climate is changing. So we've found, for a start, many people are not coming with a list of objections to the Christian faith. Now, that's partly because they know so little of the Christian faith, they don't even know what their objections should be.
Yeah.
But it's also because there is just less hostility. So you get to a Q&A and the tone of a meeting is noticeably different these days. People are genuinely interested to see if Christians have something worth saying. And I think our way into speaking to people has been different too. So rather than taking the kind of common objections, we're trying to take the common concerns or the existential desires of the average student and show how the Christian worldview makes sense of things like freedom, love, identity, significance, meaning, or big issues like human rights and human significance and that kind of stuff. And to show that actually the Christian worldview has a better foundation for those things than the functional atheism that we've been used to. So I would say there is more openness. It's certainly not revival, but it is more open than it has been over the last 10 years. And in terms of fruitfulness, certainly in the UK, but increasingly now in some other parts of Europe, increasing numbers of people coming to faith through those events than we've seen over the last 10, 15 years.
Thank you. One last question. You've had the privilege of working together and being influenced and shaped by probably the most influential university evangelist globally for the last 60 years. He's just gone to heaven, Michael Green, and you had the joy of working with him for 10 years. Could you, as a way of honouring Michael and sharing from your own learning experience, share maybe in closing 2 or 3 of the principal lessons that you learned from working with him? Because evangelists are often viewed as a kind of shooting stars working in isolation, whereas one of your practices the last 10 years has been very deliberately to try to come alongside experienced older evangelists and learn from them. Michael was the premier amongst those. What 2 or 3 things would you say were amongst the cardinal lessons that you learned from working with him?
Yeah, I think it's interesting looking back. We met actually at the first foyer conference in Sloshmitterseal back in, was it 2009? I asked him if he'd come on a mission with me that year, as it turned out to be in Sheffield. And we thought that would be the only mission we'd do. Michael felt that he was too old for it and he felt that he was probably going to die. He went on to do 10 more years and we ended up doing about 15 missions together, both in the UK and other parts of Europe. And because of that, I guess I got to not only hear him preach evangelistically, as many others had, but I also got to see what made him tick. You know, we often shared rooms. We even shared a bunk bed on one occasion on a student house party. And you got a sense of him as a person, as well as just Michael, the preacher. And I think in terms of what I noticed from Michael, 2 things particularly stand out. One was just an infectious enthusiasm in the gospel. The first talk I ever heard him give before I actually properly met him, he was asked to speak on evangelism at a student weekend. And what struck me was that actually his passion was not so much for an activity we call evangelism, but his passion was for Jesus. And there was this deep love and joy in Christ that spilled over, of course, into an enthusiasm to want to share that, as Michael used to say, to spill the beans with others. And that's really what energized him, I think. I mean, we often got introduced as the old Michael and the young Michael, although I often felt that I was the old one because he had so much enthusiasm and energy at the age of 88 that he seemed younger at times. But that youthful enthusiasm that some old people have the temptation to grow kind of bitter in their old age or cynical. And there was no cynicism about Michael. There was no bitterness. There was no naivety either. But there was just a deep joy in the gospel that had come partly from remaining active in Christian ministry throughout his whole life, rather than just taking a back seat. So I think his enthusiasm was one. I think his humility really stood out as well, which was, again, maybe not something people would see if they only heard him speak. But he was a very servant-hearted person who would express that in different ways. I remember the first student weekend we spoke on, we shared a bunk bed in a dormitory. As soon as the meal finished, There were volunteers asked to do the washing up. The first person in the kitchen was Michael, rolling his sleeves up, doing the washing up. The first person to pack away the bookstall and carry it through the snow was Michael. The first person to start washing the toilets at the end of the weekend was Michael. So there was no sense of superiority or using his position to exempt him from doing more menial tasks. And that really communicated quite powerfully, particularly working with students on the ground who saw this really Christ-like model of humility. I think from his preaching, the thing that really impacted me was an expectation that people would come to Christ. Before I did Missions of Michael, I guess I had seen a few people come to Christ, but I remember that first mission, we saw quite a few people make commitments of faith, which totally surprised me. And I thought, well, why is this happening? Is it just chance that Michael happened to preach to an audience where everyone was ready to become a Christian? Or was it that he was doing something that helped precipitate people to make that decision of repentance and faith? And what I noticed is that he put a great deal of emphasis and preparation into how he would finish his evangelistic talk, whereas I historically would have just written in my notes conclusion and would have just said whatever came to mind at the time. Yeah. And so Michael would be very clear at explaining the kind of response that people might make. He would have something to say to the skeptics. He would have something to say to the people who were not yet convinced. But then he would always spend a fair amount of his talk, sometimes 10, 15 minutes, explaining what commitment would look like, often using a kind of biblical metaphor. The idea of Jesus standing at the door and knocking, or the idea of marriage, two people making a commitment to each other. He sometimes used to use the analogy of the sperm and the egg, which I never thought went down quite so well, or that used to precipitate a lot of laughter in the audience. But the idea of commitment and new life was what he was wanting to illustrate. And then he would also try to anticipate some of the objections that people might have, the doubts that they might still be battling with, the fears that they might have about what it might mean if they commit their life to Christ. And then lead people in a prayer of repentance and faith. But then the key thing I learned from Michael is that he didn't stop when his talk finished. And the talk would end, but then he would always have a pile of his little booklets called Yes, which are really a book to explain what commitment looks like. And he would often tell the audience he would be cruising amongst the assembled multitude at the end. But what he would do is, because he had these booklets, he would then be able to get into conversation with folks who had either responded or were on the verge of doing so, and enabled him then to do really good one-to-one work with people who were most interested. Whereas again, before that, I would just stand at the front and wait for people to talk to me, which was either no one or the angry atheist that wanted to have a debate. But watching and learning from Michael meant that we could actually not only just speak from the front, but help that follow-up get started well by being part of it from the outset.
Well, I remember Michael speaking here at the European Leadership Forum 10 years ago, and he was a mere 78-year-old, and he rushed through the hall outside, and it was just like a flash of light, and I called him, Michael, where are you going? He said, I'm just going to do my third seminar of the day. It was about midday, and I said, why are you in such a hurry? I've just done one. I'm very tired. He said, I'm doing so much because I want to die with my bootstraps on. And I guess for both of us, the other thing that struck us about him was his joyfulness in serving Christ. It wasn't that he didn't have any knocks in life, but he retained an essential joy in Christ all his days. And I remember one of the very first mission weeks we did in his late 70s in Cardiff University. At the end of the week, there was a day away for the students. And I asked one of the students there, as he looked back on the week, what he had enjoyed most about the week. He saw Michael in the distance. He pointed to him and he said, see that man over there? He's nearly 80. If I love to be 80, I want to be like that. So if God spares you and I that long, may we be joyful to the end. Yeah. And may those who've listened to this interview today also serve Christ joyfully, persevering to the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you.